Hello and welcome back to the Librarian of the Rings. Today we are going to be talking about Chapter 8 of the Silmarillion of the Darkening of Valinor. Welcome back, my name is Ben, I'm the librarian, and today we are going to be looking at Chapter 8 of the Silmarillion. This is a really short chapter, but it contains one of the most important events that happens in all of Tolkien's Legendarium. So get ready, there's going to be some important stuff in here, not a ton packed into this chapter, but some really important points. As always, we're going to start off by going through any vocabulary that we need to understand for this chapter. Then we'll talk about the major characters that play a role in this chapter. Then we'll talk about the major events that actually make this chapter what it is. And then we'll talk about any themes that we're tracking as we go through the Silmarillion and how they appear in this chapter. So first up, vocabulary. We've only got a couple new vocabulary words here, so there's not too much. We're really establishing our vocabulary at this point, so a lot of these words we're now familiar with. We kind of know what they mean and what Tolkien is doing with them, but let's just hit on a couple of them. First, we have Avathar, and Avathar is another geography word, and this is basically the dark region of Aman. So Aman is the continent on which the Valar and now many of the elves live. Remember, it's not Middle-earth, but it's still part of the same world as Middle-earth. It's another continent, and there's a dark region of this continent which is called Avathar. We really haven't seen darkness in Aman before, so this is definitely a big change. We're seeing something very different in this chapter. And the second word that we need to learn today is also related to darkness, and that is unlight. So unlight is essentially the opposite of light, not the absence of light, which is what darkness normally is. It's just light not being there. This is different. Unlight is like an actual substantive thing that exists as the opposite of light. And that will make more sense as we go along. That leads us into the characters, because there's a character that we need to know in order to understand the unlight. And that character is Ungoliant. And Ungoliant is the giant spider. Now, if you're coming from the Lord of the Rings, of course, your hook here is going to be other giant spiders, specifically Shelob. So she is the child of Ungoliant. So Ungoliant, really a big deal, a massive spider. Well, is she a spider? We don't really know what she is, actually. It seems most likely that she is one of the Maya that has come down into Middle-earth and taken on a spider-like form. So not really a spider, but think of her like a spider when you're picturing her. And the Valar don't know where she came from, but it seems most likely that she must be a Maya. And there's speculation in the chapter that she was one of those that Melkor kind of called into his service, but then she decided she wanted to be in charge of herself. So Melkor, not really in charge of her, but we'll kind of see some interaction between them in this chapter and in the next chapter. Which brings us to the rest of our characters. There aren't any other new characters that we need to learn about here, but let's just refresh on a couple of the characters that are important here. Melkor being the first one. Melkor, obviously the big bad guy. Remember, thinking back to Lord of the Rings, Sauron is one of Melkor's servants. So Melkor is the big bad. He's the only one of the Valar that went bad, and he's basically going to cause all the trouble in all of the Silmarillion. And in this chapter, he's going to cause some major trouble. Now, there are several other Valar that are mentioned. We're getting pretty used to them by this point, but one that we really want to pay attention to here is Manwë. And remember, Manwë is the king of Arda. He's the king of the whole world. He's the Valar that Iluvatar has basically left in charge of the world. Also remember that Manwë and Melkor were brothers in the mind of Iluvatar. Okay, there's going to be a few other Valar mentioned, but I think you probably have a pretty good grasp of who they are at this point. So let's talk about a couple of elves. Now, Fëanor is a guy we know from the last chapter. He's the greatest of elven craftsmen. He made the Silmarils, and the Silmarils are the things that everybody is into. Everybody wants to see them. But if you remember, at this point, Fëanor has been banished from Tirion, the city in which he lived and crafted the Silmarils, because he tried to assault his brother with a sword. And the Valar were like, you're going to have to spend 12 years out of Tirion for that. And who is his brother? Fingolfin. Now, Fingolfin, we know from the last chapter when he had this little tiff with Fëanor. He's just like pretty good, solid guy. He's Finwë's second son, the first son of Finwë's second marriage. And so he is basically acting king of the Noldor right now because Finwë has abdicated to go off with Fëanor, and Fëanor's not there, so Fingolfin He's the guy in charge. And Fingolfin's going to take some actions in this chapter that are going to impact him and his children and many of the Noldor for thousands of years afterwards. So keep track of what Fingolfin's doing. It's going to be important. Which leads us, of course, to the major events in this chapter. Now, obviously, as most Silmarillion chapters do, this one just kind of lays it all out there. It's called the Darkening of Valinor, so we can kind of expect it to get dark. And what gives light to Valinor? Well, the trees do. And so we expect there to be some tree stuff. But we start off not with the trees, but with Melkor. And Melkor is going into Avathar, and he is talking to Ungoliant. And obviously, they know each other from some other time in their past, and he's trying to convince her to come with him and help him with something. And Ungoliant, she's not into that. She's like, hey, I don't really want to just like lay siege to Valinor. That doesn't seem cool. But Melkor knows something about Ungoliant. He knows that she is ravenous and she wants to eat. And the thing that she likes to eat is light. That's right, because she can spin out light as unlight. Those are her dark webs. So he knows that she wants to eat some light. And so he convinces her to come, saying that whatever she wants, whatever she hungers for, he will give to her. He says he will give it to her with both hands. And so she's convinced. She's like, okay, I'll do it. I'll come with you. And they set off on their little plan. Then we kind of shift gears for the next major event. This is Manwë. Manwë is calling a giant feast, basically a harvest feast. Even though there aren't any seasons in Aman, because the trees are always there, they're still going to have basically this harvest feast and festival. It's going to happen in Valinor, and that's important. It's not happening in Tirion, where the elves live. They're being invited to Valinor for this feast, for this festival. And that means that Fëanor can come. Not only can Fëanor come, Manwë commands him to come. At which point Finwë says, not going to come. But Fëanor, he has to. And although Finwë doesn't play any major role in this chapter, it is important to know that he stayed behind. He is not at this celebration. And while this is happening, Melkor and Ungoliant are still on their way. They are scaling the unscalable mountains. And how can they do this? Well, because Ungoliant can spin webs, and she can use her threads to climb these unscalable mountains and then weave ladders for Melkor to climb up after her. So they're coming while this party is going on, this huge party. And of course, at this party, we get our next major event. Fëanor, who has had to come, and Fingolfin, who has been invited to come, they, of course, encounter each other. And this is the first time they've seen each other since Fëanor got banished. And so there's some tense moments here, but Fingolfin, always the bigger man, just continues on his path of forgiveness and tells Fëanor that what he said before still stands. He's still willing to follow Fëanor as the leader of the Noldor once his exile is up. And Fëanor, he doesn't really say anything, but he at least shakes hands with Fingolfin. So basically, Fingolfin is saying, hey, Fëanor, you are still the king of the Noldor. I will be your brother always, and I will follow you. And that's going to be really important, because what comes later and where he follows him may not be the best choice. But Manwë is basically achieving what he wants with this party now. He wanted Fingolfin and Fëanor to be able to start being reconciled. He wanted the Noldor to start to be able to heal from this rift. So things seem to be going pretty well right before everything goes dark. See, Ungoliant has basically woven this web of unlight around herself and Melkor, so they can't be detected. And so they come up to the trees, not able to be seen, and Melkor, who has this huge spear, stabs each of the trees, and that allows Ungoliant to go and suck out their sap, which is their light. And while she does this, she also poisons them. And so the trees die, and the light is gone. At this point, of course, Orome and Tolkis, they want to go after Melkor, but they can't. They're stopped by the darkness and the unlight. They can't find them. And that's where this chapter ends. This chapter is only about 5 pages long, but this really, really important event has happened. The trees have been killed. Their light has gone out. And basically, the rest of the story is going to follow along from this, because we know one thing. The only place that the light of the trees is still in existence now is inside of the Silmarils. But Fëanor, he didn't bring the Silmarils with him, because he's in such a state of pride and selfishness. He was like, I'm not going to bring my jewels to this party, because I don't want anyone to see them but me, my dad, and my sons. And that's where we leave this. But let's talk about some of the big themes that are in this chapter. There's really 2 themes that I want to highlight. The first one is vows and promises. Now, vows and promises is one that we really haven't hit on before, but it's going to become really important from here on out. The things that people vow or the things that people promise are often done rashly, and they almost always come back to bite them. There's going to be one big vow. It's going to be a major problem for the entire rest of the story. But right now, the one that we've seen is Fingolfin making this promise to follow his brother Valinor, basically to allow him to be the king of the Noldor. And that is going to come back in a big way. Fingolfin is probably going to regret having made that choice. The other vow that we have in this story that is going to cause a problem for the person who made it later on is Melkor's promise to Ungoliant that he will give her whatever she wants with both hands. Stay tuned for that, because that is going to pay out in a way that Melkor isn't going to like at all. And then the second theme is light and darkness. Now, light and darkness is a major theme throughout Tolkien's work, so I think it's just good for us to point this out. The trees were a source of light. Of course, we had the lamps before the trees, and they were destroyed by Melkor, and now we have the trees that are being destroyed by Melkor and Ungoliant together. And so we've got this light and darkness dichotomy, and how that's going to play out throughout the story will come out in many ways. This one is a very kind of physical aspect of that dichotomy, where you actually have the trees, you actually have the unlight of Ungoliant, and Ungoliant actually shows up and destroys the trees. So there's a very kind of physical presence to it. But of course, the light and darkness thing will play out metaphorically throughout this story, and of course, into The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings as well. Okay, that's going to do it for us today. I hope you've enjoyed looking at Chapter 8. If you have any questions at all, please drop down in the comments and let me know those. And also let me know what you think about this chapter. And until next time, farewell wherever you fare. May your ears receive you at your journey's end.